the weakest species in the galaxy. The hall was enormous. It was so large that the far end of it disappeared into a soft blue haze. The ceiling rose hundreds of meters above the floor, carved from a single piece of pale stone that had been cut from the moon of a dead planet. Thousands of seats lined the curved walls in wide, rising rows, and in each seat sat a representative of a different species. There were beings with 4 arms, and beings with no arms at all. There were creatures that breathed liquid, and creatures that glowed faintly in the dark. There were species so ancient that their homeworlds had already gone cold, and species so young they had only recently learned to build ships. This was the grand chamber of the Galactic Conclave. It was the most powerful room in the known universe. And today, for the first time in history, humans were sitting in it. Their seats were at the very bottom, the lowest row. The chairs reserved for observer species that had no vote, no voice, and no real place at the table. They were guests in the way that a child is a guest at an adult dinner. Tolerated, occasionally smiled at, not taken seriously. There were 6 of them in total. Commander Yael Okafor sat at the far left. He was a tall man, dark-skinned, with short gray hair and quiet eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing. He had spent 20 years fighting in Earth's colonial wars against rebels, pirates, hostile terrain, and the simple cruelty of distance. He had won most of them. He had survived all of them. He did not speak much, and when he did, people listened. Next to him sat Ambassador Lena Marsh. She was a small woman with pale skin and dark hair pulled back tight. She had a sharp face and sharper eyes, and she had spent the last 15 years of her life learning how to speak to people who did not want to hear her. She was very good at it. She looked calm now. She always looked calm. The others in the delegation were aides and analysts. Smart people, all of them, but not yet tested the way Okafor and Marsh had been. The session opened with the usual formalities. Species after species rose to speak about trade, about borders, about shared laws and mutual protection. The conclave had been doing this for thousands of years. It ran like a machine. A slow, ancient, perfectly tuned machine. Then Grand Arbiter Voss's Karath rose to speak. He was Dravhari, the dominant species in the galaxy, or at least the one that believed most firmly in its own dominance. The Dravhari were tall, perhaps 2.5 meters, with pale silver skin and long limbs that moved with a kind of elegant ease. Their faces had 4 eyes arranged in a gentle curve, and their mouths were thin and precise. They were, by almost every measurable standard, physically superior to most known species. They had been spacefaring for over 4,000 years. Their empire covered 38 star systems. They had never lost a war. Voss's Karath stood at the central podium and looked across the hall. His gaze moved over the assembled species and landed, briefly, on the human delegation in the bottom row. Something shifted in his expression, not quite contempt, but close to it, more like the mild curiosity one might feel when looking at an insect. He began his speech. He spoke about the recent survey his empire had conducted, a biological and cultural assessment of humanity, requested by the conclave as part of standard evaluation for new observer species. His researchers had been thorough. He presented the data with the calm confidence of a man reading out the results of something that was never really in doubt. Humans, he explained, had a lifespan of roughly 80 years, sometimes 90. A number of species in the conclave lived for 300 to 500. The Dravhari themselves routinely reached 250. Humans had no natural armor. No shells, no thick hides, no reinforced bone structures. Their skin was thin enough to cut with moderate pressure. Their bones, while reasonably dense, broke under stress that most spacefaring species would consider minor. Their sensory range was limited. They could not see in the dark without tools. Their hearing was poor compared to most predatory species. They had no ability to detect electromagnetic fields, no chemical sensing beyond basic smell, no sonar. They reproduced slowly, with single births being most common, and their young were helpless for years. They had, in the summary of the Dravhari biological report, no exceptional physical traits, no evolutionary advantages of note, and no characteristics that would suggest significant survival value in a hostile galactic environment. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then came the sound. It was not laughter exactly. It was too polite for that. Too controlled. It was the sound of amusement passing through thousands of different species in thousands of different ways. Some clicked their mandibles. Some rumbled deep in their chests. Some simply looked at the human delegation with wide, curious eyes that said everything without saying anything. Lena Marsh sat perfectly still through all of it. Her face did not move. Her hands rested flat on the arms of her chair. Yael Okafor also did not move. But his eyes moved. They moved to the data screens at the front of the chamber, where the Dravhari had projected their charts and maps. And as the laughter settled and Voss's Kareth continued to speak, Okafor noticed something. In the corner of one of the maps, small, easy to miss, clearly not intended to be highlighted, there were markers, location markers, placed precisely on 5 of humanity's frontier colony systems. He said nothing. He simply noted it and looked away. Voss's Kareth concluded his presentation. He thanked the conclave for its time. He looked down at the human delegation one more time. And then, in a tone that was almost gentle, the way one speaks to something that cannot help what it is, he said, "We welcome humanity to its seat. It is a species still surprised by fire. Perhaps, with time and guidance, it will learn." More amusement from the hall. Quiet. Dignified. Devastating. The session moved on. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Marsh walked beside Okafor in silence for a long moment. The corridor was wide and cool, lit by strips of soft white light. Alien dignitaries passed them in both directions, most not even glancing their way. Finally, Okafor spoke, his voice low. "Those location markers on the second map, the ones on our colony borders." Marsh nodded. She had seen them too. "That was a census survey," she said. "It was targeting data," he replied. She didn't argue. She simply pulled out her communication device and sent one message back to Earth. It was short. It said only, "Eyes open. Begin preliminary protocols." 3 days later, the Dravhari Empire sent a formal communication to Earth's governing council. The language was calm, polished, and professional. It informed humanity that 3 of its frontier colony systems, Red Line Station, the Meridian Cluster, and the Outer Vela Point, were located within a zone the Empire considered part of its natural sphere of expansion. As a condition of peaceful coexistence, humanity was expected to vacate and transfer these systems to Dravhari administration within 60 standard days. In exchange, humanity would receive a formal letter of recognition from the Empire and a modest economic credit applicable toward trade within Dravhari space. That was the offer. There was no alternative given, because the Dravhari did not believe one was necessary. On Earth, in the War Cabinet chamber in Geneva, Admiral Constance Rhee read the message twice. Then, she set it down on the table. She looked around the room at the generals, the analysts, the diplomats, and the scientists seated before her. She said, "Good." Nobody asked her what she meant. They already knew. The 60 days began counting down. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of history, something very old in the human bloodline woke up and started paying attention. What humans forgot to mention, the War Cabinet chamber in Geneva was underground. It had been built that way on purpose, 300 meters below street level, inside a mountain of reinforced concrete and layered steel. The walls did not shake when things happened above. The lights did not flicker. The air was recycled and steady. It was a room designed for clear thinking in the middle of chaos, and it had been used exactly that way for over 2 centuries. Admiral Constance Rhee sat at the head of the table. She was 61 years old, short, wide-shouldered, with gray hair cut close to her head and a face that looked like it had been carved from patience. She had commanded ships for 30 years and land operations for 10 before that. She had never given an order she was not prepared to see through to its end. Around the table sat the full War Cabinet, generals, fleet commanders, intelligence directors, weapons specialists, and at the far end, Dr. Soren Hald, a thin man with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers who was Earth's chief xenobiologist and who had, over the past 6 months, I've been quietly working on a document that no one outside this room had yet seen. Ree nodded at him. He stood and opened his report. I want to start, he said, by telling you what the Dravhari got right. He clicked to the first page of his presentation. It was the same data Voss's Karath had shown the conclave. The lifespan charts, the physical comparisons, the sensory range tables. They got all of this correct, Hald said. Humans are physically unremarkable by galactic standards. We are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We do not live the longest. Our senses are limited. Our bodies are fragile. Every single measurement they took is accurate. He paused. The problem, he continued, is that they measured the wrong things. He clicked to the next page. Humans are one of the only known species in the galaxy that evolved as persistence predators. This means that on our original homeworld, we did not chase prey and kill it quickly. We followed it. For hours. Sometimes for days. We ran at a steady pace until the animal we were hunting was so exhausted it could no longer move. And then we walked up to it and ended it. This required the ability to regulate body temperature under sustained physical effort, something almost no other sentient species evolved. It required the ability to function through pain and fatigue at levels that would cause most other species to stop. It required patience so deep it became biological. He let that sit for a moment. There is almost no sentient species in the conclave that can match a healthy human being in sustained physical endurance. Not one. The Dravhari, who are physically superior to us in almost every other way, would collapse from heatstroke, attempting to run the distances we cover in basic military training. He clicked again. Pain tolerance. Human beings can continue to function under injury that would send most known species into shock or unconsciousness. This is not bravery. It is not stubbornness. It is physiology. Our nervous system is built differently. We feel pain as information, a signal, rather than as a shutdown command. A soldier of many galactic species, when seriously wounded, will stop. A human soldier, in many documented cases, will not. Someone at the table shifted in their seat. Adaptation speed, Hald continued. Human neuroplasticity, the ability of our brains to rewire themselves in response to new challenges, is extraordinary. We learn new weapons faster than almost any other species. We adapt to new environments, new tactics, new threats, with a speed that, when you look at our medical and military data, is genuinely difficult to explain by normal evolutionary standards. The leading theory is that our history of continuous internal warfare forced this trait at an accelerated rate. He looked up from his notes. That brings me to perhaps the most important point. Humanity has been at war with itself for our entire recorded history. We have been fighting each other on land, at sea, in the air, and in space for thousands of years without stop. Every other major spacefaring civilization in the conclave reached a period of unified peace before they expanded outward. They stopped fighting among themselves and then went to the stars. We never stopped. We went to the stars while still fighting. What this means is that our military experience, in terms of total accumulated hours of actual combat, exceeds the combined battlefield experience of every species in the conclave put together. We did not simulate wars. We did not theorize wars. We fought them, constantly, in every possible terrain, climate, and condition, against opponents who knew us perfectly and could predict our tactics. We had to keep getting better, or we would lose to ourselves. The room was very quiet. And finally, Hald said, his voice dropping slightly, there is the psychological factor. Humans form emotional bonds with things in a way that most species consider unusual. We name our ships. We name our weapons. We name our enemies. We hold grief the way some species hold memory deep, permanent, and motivating. When a human loses something they care about, it does not slow them down, it focuses them. Other species in the conclave find this difficult to understand. The Dravhari, based on every cultural profile we have of them, have no framework for it whatsoever. He closed his report. The Dravhari conducted an excellent survey, he said. They simply did not know what questions to ask. Ree thanked him, and he sat down. She stood. 60 days, she said. That is the window we have been given. We will not spend it negotiating. We will spend it preparing. She looked around the table. Operation Long Patience begins now. The plan was not complicated. That was the point. Complex plans required large supply chains, precise timing, and things going right. Operation Long Patience was built on the assumption that things would go wrong and worked from there. Every frontier colony was given 2 sets of instructions. The first was the official one, prepare for possible evacuation. The second, sent on a separate encrypted channel, was the real one. Do not leave. Fortify. At Redline Station, the colony commander was a former Earth military engineer named Bautista. He read the second set of orders, then looked at his station, a mid-sized industrial outpost built into the rock of a captured asteroid, designed for mining and shipping, not for war. He spent 48 hours walking every tunnel and corridor and shaft in the station. He talked to every worker, every technician, every ship captain who was docked there. Then he called his team together, and they started building. They collapsed tunnels to create choke points. They rigged mining charges along the outer hull in patterns that would destroy attacking ships while leaving the station's core intact. They took 4 civilian cargo vessels and spent 10 days gutting their interiors and fitting them with salvaged military railguns. They buried automated sensor drones in the asteroid field surrounding the station, each one disguised as dead rock. When the 60 days ended and the Dravhari fleet arrived at Redline Station, they found what they expected to find. A small, unremarkable industrial outpost. No warships, no defensive satellites. Just a rock with lights. The Dravhari commander, following standard protocol for a low-resistance occupation, sent his first wave in close. The first 3 ships were destroyed before they crossed the entry threshold, not by missiles by the railguns on the disguised cargo ships. Firing from positions the Dravhari sensors had not registered as threats. The Dravhari pulled back and reassessed. They sent the second wave with shields raised and weapons active. Bautista triggered the tunnel collapses. 6 boarding parties disappeared into dead rock. The sensor drones in the asteroid field began transmitting false fleet signatures, pulling Dravhari ships in 3 wrong directions at once. It took the Dravhari 11 days to take Redline Station. They lost 17 warships doing it. They had planned to lose none. 17 warships, for 1 mining outpost, defended by civilians with repurposed cargo ships and mining charges. The Dravhari commander filed his report to the Empire. He called Redline an anomaly, unusually fortified, unusually stubborn. A local exception. He was wrong. But he did not know that yet. Back in Geneva, when the report on Redline Station reached Admiral Ree's desk, she read it once. Then she looked at her fleet commanders and said, "They still think this is about the colonies." She let that sit. Let them keep thinking that. Outside, the Earth continued to turn. Ships were being loaded in quiet orbital docks, far from Dravhari sensor range. Officers were receiving orders. Crews were being briefed. Factories that had been producing shipping containers were quietly, efficiently switching over to something else. The Dravhari had taken their first colony. They expected the rest would follow quickly, and after that, perhaps a formal submission from Earth's government, some kind of diplomatic language that meant surrender, without calling it that. They were still expecting it when the first human fleet crossed into their territory. The rules of war nobody taught them. Strategist Oren Vel had been in the Dravhari military for 60 years. He had studied every major conflict his empire had fought. He had read every tactical manual produced by every spacefaring civilization in the conclave. He had walked through the wreckage of 3 different enemy fleets and understood, in each case, exactly why they had lost. He considered himself a thorough man, a careful man, a man who was not surprised easily. He was surprised now. He sat in the command center of his flagship, the Sovereign Reach, and stared at the battle display in front of him. The display showed the current position of every ship in his patrol group, 41 Dravhari warships, the most advanced vessels his empire produced, crewed by experienced soldiers with excellent training and the best equipment in the known galaxy. It also showed, in blinking red, the positions of the 12 human ships that had just destroyed 9 of his warships in under 4 minutes and were now gone. Not retreating, not fleeing. Gone. Vanished into the sensor noise of open space, as if they had never been there. Orenvel looked at his sensor chief. "Find them," he said. "We're trying, strategist. They're running without active emissions. We have no thermal signature, no drive signature, nothing." Orenvel turned back to the display. He studied the pattern of the attack again. The human ships had not formed a line. They had not declared their engagement range. They had not identified themselves or issued a challenge. They had appeared from 3 different directions at once, from behind an inactive debris field, from the shadow of a nearby moon, and from directly underneath his fleet at a low approach angle that his sensors had classified as background noise. They had fired with extreme precision at his command ships first. Not his heaviest ships. His command ships. The vessels that coordinated the fleet's movements and communications. Then they had disappeared. In 60 years of military study, Orenvel had never read about this exact tactic. He found the absence deeply unsettling. He sent a priority message to the Empire's Central Fleet Command. He described what had happened. He recommended caution. He said specifically, "They do not fight like a species that is defending. They fight like a species that has been planning this." End. The response came 6 hours later. It told him to proceed with the original objective and not to be alarmed by isolated incidents. He read the message twice. Then he folded it and put it away and went back to studying his display. Far away, aboard the UES Unbroken, Captain Dara Suarez was eating a cold meal at her command station and reading the post-engagement report from her 12-ship group. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with brown skin and short dark hair, and an expression that rested naturally in something close to calm assessment. She had commanded ships for 15 years. She had fought in Earth's last 3 major internal conflicts, before joining the UEF, when the Dravhari ultimatum arrived. She put down her fork and looked at her tactical officer. How long before they reposition? Based on their movement pattern, probably another 3 hours before they establish a new formation. Good. She looked at the navigation display. Move us to the secondary vector. I want to hit their supply convoy before they get the fleet reorganized. Her tactical officer nodded. The UES Unbroken and its 11 companion ships had been in Dravhari space for 9 days. In that time, they had destroyed or disabled 22 Dravhari warships, 4 supply freighters, and 1 communications relay station. They had not lost a single ship. The method was simple. Never attack from the same direction twice. Never stay in one place after firing. Never chase a retreating enemy into their own prepared positions. Hit and move. Hit and move. Find the supply lines, the slow, heavy ships carrying fuel and ammunition and food, and destroy them first. A fleet that cannot refuel is a fleet that cannot fight. It was not elegant. The Dravhari would not have called it honorable. It was effective. On the 3rd day, Orenvel had sent a formal communication to the human fleet. The message said, "You fight without honor. Name your engagement coordinates, and we will meet you as equals." Captain Suarez had read the message, thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, and replied, "We fight to win. You should try it." Orenvel did not respond. The battle that changed everything happened near a region of space known informally as the Cauldron Nebula, a dense cloud of ionized gas and particulate matter that stretched across 11 light hours. It was a difficult place to navigate. Sensors behaved strangely inside it. Signals bent and scattered. Ships had to fly partially blind, relying on short-range instruments and careful piloting. Most military commanders avoided it. Suarez had chosen it as a home. Orenvel had eventually figured out that the human ships were using the nebula as a staging area. He had assembled his response carefully. 40 warships, the largest group he had committed to a single engagement. He would enter the nebula from 3 points simultaneously, corner the humans inside it, and finish the problem. It was a reasonable plan. It failed completely. The human ships did not try to escape. They moved deeper into the nebula. Druvhari sensors lost them within minutes. The Druvhari fleet pushed inward, trying to relocate them with active sensor sweeps. The active sweeps did nothing. The nebula scattered every pulse. The humans, as Orenvel later pieced together, had switched to analog targeting, physical optics, manual calculations, stripped-down mechanical systems that the electromagnetic interference of the nebula could not touch. It was old technology. So old it was almost pre-spaceflight. No Druvhari ship carried it because no Druvhari military planner had ever considered that it might be necessary. Why would they? It was primitive. But it worked perfectly inside the Cauldron Nebula. And the Druvhari systems did not work at all. Suarez's 12 ships moved through the nebula like they knew every meter of it, because they had spent 2 weeks mapping it exactly, and picked apart the 40-ship Druvhari formation, one cluster at a time. Ships that could not see them, could not coordinate with each other, could not track a target. 23 Druvhari warships were destroyed or crippled before Orenvel ordered a full withdrawal. He pulled the surviving ships out of the nebula and sat in his command chair for a long time in silence. Then he wrote another message to the Central Command. It was longer this time. It said that the human forces were demonstrating tactical flexibility that exceeded anything in his experience or his records. It said they appeared to carry backup systems for their backup systems. It said they planned for failure the way the Druvhari planned for success, and that this was a fundamental difference in military philosophy that his empire had not accounted for. It said the situation was no longer a border conflict with a minor species. It said, "We have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Central Command read the message. They reassigned Orenvel to a secondary post and sent a younger commander to replace him. The young commander arrived with fresh ships, fresh confidence, and very little experience. Meanwhile, Yael Okafor was somewhere he had not planned to be. His insertion team had been conducting a raid on a Druvhari communications hub, a small station, lightly defended, important. The raid had gone cleanly until the final extraction, when a Druvhari quick response patrol had arrived 6 minutes earlier than the intelligence window predicted. 3 of his team had made it to the ship. He had not. He was captured, taken aboard a Druvhari patrol vessel, locked in a containment cell. The Druvhari soldiers who captured him were professional. They did not harm him. They seemed to expect him to be afraid, some combination of agitation, submission, or panic. They watched him carefully through the cell's observation panel, the way one watches an unfamiliar animal. Okafor sat on the floor of his cell. He was calm. His breathing was slow. He had one broken rib, a cut above his left eye, and no communication device. He assessed what he had. He assessed the cell. He noted the patrol pattern of the guards, the timing of the lock cycles, the ventilation layout, the material of the walls. After 3 hours, a senior Druvhari officer came to question him. The officer spoke through a translation unit, clipped to his collar. He asked about the human fleet's positions, their numbers, their supply routes. Okafor said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, simply, "Your patrol schedules are 17 minutes apart. Your lock mechanism has a 3-second delay on manual override, and the ventilation shaft behind panel 7 is wide enough." The Druvhari officer stared at him. Wide enough for what? He finally asked. Okafor looked at him with quiet, tired eyes. "I'm still deciding," he said. He was moved to a more secure cell immediately. A cell with no ventilation access, and guards posted every 8 minutes. He noted the new schedule and started again. The Druvhari soldiers talked about him afterward. They said the human was strange. They said he did not seem afraid. They said he did not seem angry either. He simply seemed to be thinking about something they could not see. That night, Orenvel, now removed from active command but still aboard the Sovereign Reach on transit, wrote one last note. Not a military report. A personal observation. He sent it to the Senior Research Division of the Druvhari Academy. It said, "We assumed fear would be their response to superior force. We were wrong. I have reviewed every available record of human behavior under pressure. They do not experience confrontation the way we do. I cannot find a word in our language for what they do instead. The closest I can come is, they become more themselves. He sent the note and lay down and stared at the ceiling. Outside, in the dark between stars, more human ships were moving. Not racing, not charging. Moving the way something moves, when it already knows where it is going, and is simply walking there. Steady, patient, inevitable. The cost of underestimating grief. The news about Meridian reached Earth on a Tuesday morning. It came in a single transmission from one of the colony's emergency beacons, a short-range unit that had survived because it was buried deep in the station's lower infrastructure. The transmission lasted 40 seconds. It contained no voice, no video, only data. Structural collapse readings, thermal signatures, oxygen levels dropping to 0, and a timestamp that matched the day the Dravhari Empire's Second Fleet had moved through that system. 4,211 people had lived at the Meridian cluster. Scientists, engineers, miners, families, children. The colony had been 8 years old. It had not been a military target. It had not been armed. It had submitted its evacuation notice on time, within the original 60-day window, and was in the process of transporting its population out when the Dravhari fleet arrived early and did not wait. Admiral Rhee received the transmission in her office at 3 in the morning. She read it. She sat still for a while. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the city lights of Geneva below her and stood there until the sun came up. She did not cancel any meetings. She did not change any orders. She did not make a speech. She sent one communication to every active UEF commander. It was 8 words long. Meridian is gone. You know what that means. Every commander who received that message went quiet for a moment when they read it. Then they went back to work. Not faster, exactly. More focused, more settled. Like something that had been a question was now an answer. In the galactic conclave, the news moved differently. Species that had laughed at humanity 8 months ago were now watching their communication screens with something much closer to attention. The data from the war was difficult to understand at first. Numbers that did not fit the expected shape. A species with no natural advantages, no long military history by galactic standards, no advanced technology beyond what other species also possessed, somehow grinding down the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. There were theories. Perhaps humans had hidden weapons. Perhaps they had allied with another species secretly. Perhaps the Dravhari had made a series of unusual tactical errors. Elder Shoan, a senior diplomat from the Verith Collective, a quiet species from a distant system that had been in the conclave for over 3,000 years and had survived by being careful, read all the theories. He dismissed all of them. He had been watching the humans since their first day in the chamber. He had noticed things others had not. He requested an emergency session of the conclave. It took 4 days to arrange. The chamber filled again. Same seats, same haze, same carved stone ceiling. But the feeling was different. The comfortable certainty that had floated through the room 8 months ago was gone. Something else was in its place. Something cautious. Ambassador Lena Marsh entered the chamber and took her seat in the observer's row, the same bottom-level seat she had sat in before. She had not been given a higher position. The conclave had not yet officially changed humanity's status. She sat where she had always sat. Elder Shoan opened the session. He spoke about the conflict. He presented casualty data, territorial changes, economic disruption to the shipping lanes that ran through the affected systems. He was precise, neutral, careful with his words. Then he said, "I would like to invite Ambassador Marsh to address the chamber." There was a pause. Observers did not address the chamber. It was not protocol, but nobody objected. Marsh stood. She was the same small woman, with the same dark hair and the same sharp, still face. She did not bring notes. She did not use a display panel. She simply stood and looked up at the thousands of faces arranged in their rising rows above her, and she began to speak. She did not speak about military strategy. She did not threaten anyone. She did not raise her voice. Her tone was almost conversational, quiet, even. The tone of someone explaining something simple to an intelligent person who had simply not been told before. She spoke about Meridian. She described the colony. She described the people. She said their names, Not all 4,000, but enough. She talked about the kind of place it was. A young colony. Scientists studying a nearby pulsar. Children in a school that had a view of the stars through a reinforced dome because one of the teachers had thought it was important for children to see the sky. The chamber was completely silent. Then she said, "I am not going to threaten the Dravhari Empire. That is not why I am standing here." She paused. "I am going to do something different. I am going to tell you something about human history." She talked for 20 minutes. She spoke about every major civilization in Earth's own history that had underestimated humanity. Not aliens, other humans. Internal enemies, internal empires, internal conflicts. Every case where one group had decided that another group of humans was too weak, too small, too primitive, too broken to fight back. She listed them, one by one. What they had believed, what they had done based on that belief, what had happened to them afterward. None of them existed anymore. She did not say this as a boast. She said it as a fact. The way a doctor tells a patient something difficult, not with cruelty, not with pleasure, just with the clear, flat weight of truth. "We are not an angry species," she said finally. "We are not a cruel species. We do not enjoy war. But we are a species that grieves. And when we grieve, we do not stop. We do not break. We remember. And we are very, very patient." She sat down. The chamber stayed silent for a long time after that. Voss's Karath was in the conclave that day. He sat in the Dravhari delegation's high-ranking seats, the best seats in the house, and he listened to every word. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt uncertain. He filed an emergency communication to the Dravhari home system that night. He recommended immediate ceasefire negotiations. He said the Empire had misjudged the situation from the beginning, and that continuing would not end in a Dravhari victory. He said it clearly, without softening. The Empire's ruling council read the message. Several members argued against it. The debate lasted 2 days. While the council debated, Orenvel removed from command, officially sidelined, watching the war from a secondary posting, made a decision. He contacted the UEF. The communication was sent through back channels, encrypted, passed through 3 neutral systems before it reached Admiral Rhee's desk. It was simple. He had information. The position of the Empire's Central Command, fleet a mobile battle station that served as the coordinating hub for all Dravhari military operations in the conflict. It was hidden, moving on a randomized pattern. Only a handful of people knew its schedule. He was one of them. In exchange, he asked for nothing. No asylum, no protection, no reward. He said only, "Stop this. I will help you stop this." Rhee looked at his message for a long time. Then she had her intelligence division verify what they could. It checked out. She authorized the information. She gave the location to her fleet commanders. And then she did something that her commanders questioned at first. She told them to plan the final offensive, not to destroy, but to demonstrate. "I want them to understand what we chose not to do," she said. "I want them to know the difference." The final offensive began in the 43rd week of the conflict. 40 UEF warships moved toward the coordinates Orenvel had provided, navigating through a region of space that Dravhari military planners had considered too hazardous for large fleet movement. The humans did not consider it hazardous. They had mapped worse. The Dravhari Central Command fleet was found exactly where Orenvel said it would be. The UEF ships did not fire first. They surrounded the command station at close range, close enough that every sensor on the Dravhari fleet could read them clearly, could measure their weapons systems, could calculate their firing solutions. And they stopped. And they waited. The Dravhari command station was silent for 11 minutes. Then its communication channel opened. The voice that came through was that of the station's senior commander, an old admiral named Dras Ken, who had been fighting wars for 40 years. He sounded, for the first time in his career, like a man who understood that he had lost. "What are your terms?" he said. Rhee's voice came back across the channel. Steady, unhurried. "We'll be in touch," she said. "Don't move." Back in Geneva, in the War Cabinet chamber 300 meters underground, One of the junior analysts looked around the room at the generals and admirals and strategists who had spent the last year of their lives in this room, and he said quietly, "We won." Nobody celebrated. Nobody cheered. They looked at each other for a moment, tired, worn, steady, and then someone refilled the coffee, and they got back to work. There was still a lot to do. The mistake they'll never make again. The grand chamber of the galactic conclave looked the same as it always had. The same enormous ceiling lost in blue haze. The same curved, rising rows of seats, filled with thousands of representatives from hundreds of species. The same pale stone walls. The same cool, recycled air. But the room did not feel the same. 6 months had passed since the Dravhari command fleet had gone quiet, and the war had ended. The peace negotiations had taken place on a neutral station, in a system that belonged to no empire. They had been conducted without theatrics. The human delegation had arrived with documents already prepared. The Dravhari delegation had arrived with the look of people who had read the documents in advance and understood, clearly, that they were not in a position to change them. The talks lasted 9 days. They were almost entirely without argument. The agreement was called the Accord of Redline. The name had been chosen by Marsh. When a Dravhari diplomat had asked why that name, she had said, simply, "Because that is where you should have stopped." He had not asked again. The terms were clear. The 3 frontier colonies, Redline Station, the Meridian Cluster, and the Outer Vela Point, were to be returned to human administration immediately, with full structural restoration funded by the Dravhari Empire. War reparations were calculated by an independent conclave panel and were significant. The Dravhari military was to be reduced to a defense-only force for a period of 50 years, with all offensive expansion prohibited. A monitoring body made up of neutral conclave species would verify compliance on an annual basis. In exchange, humanity agreed not to pursue further military action, not to claim Dravhari territory, and not to seek the dissolution of the empire. The empire would continue to exist. Its people would continue to live. Its culture would continue. It would simply not be permitted to do what it had done again. Vasis Karath had read the terms in his private office before the signing. He had read them 3 times. He had thought about the day in this very chamber, when he had stood at the podium and referred to humans as a species, still surprised by fire. He thought about how certain he had been, how obvious it had seemed. He had a long memory. It did not comfort him. Now he sat in the Dravhari delegation seats, still high up in the chamber, but somehow feeling lower than the bottom row, where humans had once been placed, and he watched the session begin. The first item of business was a formal change to the conclave's membership records. Elder Shoan stood at the central podium and read the amendment in a clear, even voice. Humanity's observer status was formally revoked. In its place, by unanimous vote of the conclave's active membership, a vote that had passed with no abstentions, which had never happened in the conclave's recorded history, humanity was elevated to the seat of the first chair. The first chair was the senior position of the conclave. It had existed for thousands of years. It carried no particular power over other members. The conclave did not work that way, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. It meant that when the conclave convened, the species holding the first chair set the agenda. It meant that in disputes, the first chair's voice was heard first. It meant, in simple terms, that the galaxy considered you first among equals. The seat had been held by the Dravhari Empire for the last 600 years. As of this session, it was not. Ambassador Marsh walked from the bottom row of the chamber, the observer row, the children's table, across the open floor of the grand chamber, to the first chair position at the head of the assembly. Every eye in the room followed her. She walked without hurrying. She sat down. She adjusted the seat slightly, because it had been designed for a Dravhari body, and was too large for her. Then she folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and looked out at the assembled species of the galaxy with the same calm expression she had always worn. From somewhere near the back of the chamber, Yael Okafor watched. He stood against the wall with his arms at his sides. He had a new scar along his jaw that had not been there a year ago. He was thinner than he had been. His eyes were the same, slow, quiet, missing nothing. He did not smile. Not because he was unhappy, but because this did not feel to him like a moment for smiling. It felt like something else. Like the end of something very long, and the beginning of something that had not yet decided what it would be. Admiral Rhee was not present. She had sent a junior representative in her place. When asked why she had not attended, she had said she had work to do, and that the ceremony would proceed fine without her. This was, most people agreed, a very typical thing for Constance Rhee to say. Voss's Kareth was required to stand. It was part of the formal proceedings. The outgoing first chair was required to stand and acknowledge the accord before the full assembly, a statement of recognition, a formal admission that the terms were accepted and that the conclave's decision was valid. It was a procedural formality. It was also the single most difficult thing Voss Kareth had done in a very long career. He stood. He read the required statement. His voice did not shake. He had enough dignity left for that. When he finished, he sat back down and looked at nothing in particular, and did not speak again for the rest of the session. Afterward, when the formal proceedings had ended, and the chamber was slowly emptying, a young diplomat approached Ambassador Marsh. She was from the Scalene sovereignty, a species that had been part of the conclave for only 200 years, still relatively new, still learning the shape of the galaxy. She had 4 eyes and pale green skin, and she was young by her species standards, barely 40. She had been watching humans carefully since Marsh's address to the chamber the previous year. She waited until the people around Marsh had moved away. Then she stepped forward. "Ambassador," she said. Her translator unit rendered her voice as something soft and careful. "May I ask you something?" Marsh looked at her. "Of course." The young diplomat was quiet for a moment, as if organizing her words. Then she said, "How were we so wrong about you? We have surveyed hundreds of species. We have classifications, categories, measurements. Everything about your biology said you were not capable of this. How were we so completely wrong?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. She looked at the young diplomat with an expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something sadder. Something in between. Something that knew things. "You saw what we can't do," she said. "You never bothered to ask what we refused to stop doing." The young diplomat thought about that. She nodded slowly, though it was clear she was still turning it over in her mind. Marsh picked up her documents and walked toward the exit. At the door, she paused and looked back at the chamber one more time. The enormous room, the rising rose, the pale stone ceiling disappearing into blue, the place where, not so long ago, a man at a podium had said that humans were still surprised by fire. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she left. In the weeks that followed, the standard databases of every major spacefaring civilization were updated to reflect the new political reality. Trade routes were adjusted. Diplomatic protocols were rewritten. Maps were redrawn. And in the archives maintained by the Galactic Conclave itself, the oldest and most complete records in the known galaxy, a small but significant change was made. The catalog of spacefaring species, maintained since the Conclave's founding, organized its entries by various classifications. One of the oldest classifications was a category that had existed since the early days of the Conclave, used for newly discovered species that were considered undeveloped, limited in capability, unlikely to significantly affect galactic affairs. The category was labeled Primitive Species of Negligible Threat. Humanity had been placed in this category upon its admission as an observer species. The entry had noted their limited lifespan, their fragile biology, their brief history of spaceflight. That entry was removed. The classification itself still existed. It still contained many species, young civilizations, early contact cases, developing worlds. The Conclave still used it. But at the top of the catalog, a new category had been added. It was placed above all others. It had no sub-entries. It had no data tables, no biological surveys, no historical notes. It simply existed as a label, waiting. It contained exactly one species. It was labeled, Do, Not Provoke. And underneath that, in the small text reserved for administrative notes, a single line had been written by whoever had made the change. No name attached, no record of authorship. Entry created following the Accord of Redline. No further classification deemed necessary. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a secondary posting far from the front lines, Orenvel received a quiet communication. It was not official. It carried no seal, no formal header. It was 3 sentences. Your information ended the war. No record of your cooperation will be made public without your consent. We do not forget. It was unsigned. He sat with it for a long time. Outside his small viewport, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The galaxy was the same galaxy, but the shape of things inside it had changed in a way that would not change back. He thought about the human soldier in the cell, the one who had counted the seconds between guard patrols and studied the ventilation layout, and looked at him with those tired, patient eyes and said, "I'm still deciding." He understood now what the human had meant, not just about the cell, about all of it. He folded the message and put it in his pocket, and looked out at the stars and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The math was finished. The accounting was done. The galaxy had made its decision. It would not make the same mistake again.